Will be there. We are. Recording is now on. Justin did that in the background. Just so you're aware, we'll only be recording Rohin's presentation. So wherever you ask questions, if you feel it's maybe a little bit stupid, that's entirely fine. We'll not be recording that part, so you're safe. Okay. All right. Rohin.
Good. So then only my stupid comments get recorded, unfortunately, so I have to be careful. Um, Thanks, Stephanie, for the kind introduction. I think, as Stephanie said, we'll try to make this more of a discussion soon. But first, I've got some content on here that I just want to walk us through. The way I'm going to do it is I'm going to do it as a two-parter. So maybe spend 10-15 minutes on each part. The first part is a bit of the methods of what I did for this paper. And the point of this is to bring out already some of the tensions we see of like doing, let's say, historical work and using historical sources, and then trying to publish in journals that are more used to the kind of quote unquote typical qual, like qual OT or qual management research, of kind of interviews and ethnography and interpretive data coding. So the first part is to walk you through that, and then I zoom out and walk you through having done that. What was then my publication journey? What were some areas, or how the paper evolved? What was some kind of comments or back and forth with editors and reviewers, and so on. And then we'll move on to kind of discussing with Shannon, and then feel free any questions that come up to start articulating them as they come. All right. Before I jump into that, this like a 30-second spiel on how this even came about, because often people are curious about how did you even pick like the Manhattan Project, let's say, and this topic. Um, for me, I when I started so I was a bit of a non-traditional candidate moving into the dissertation, in especially in today's world where we have kind of people who've done years of RA work and pre-doc and whatnot. I was just working in industry in management consulting, moved as part of a career move to business academia, management academia. But I say that to point out that because of that, I was a bit of a blank slate when I joined, both in terms of topic and method. And I immediately, early in my first year, got onto some qualitative projects because I knew that I was curious about more kind of contemporaneous qual work, which involves talking to organizations, since that is kind of what I was doing in consulting without the theoretical layer on it. So I got on some projects, immediately realized I like doing this kind of more theory building work, this kind of interpretive work that involves this kind of some level of creative sense making of a messy real world situation. But I still didn't have a topic, and I would kind of flip flop based on whatever course I happened to be taking that given term, in terms of my dissertation. And of course, I was at London Business School, which is a bit more of the US style dissertation where you're picking up a master's along the way. So you don't join with a clear articulation of what your thesis research interest is. Cut to the end of my first year, I'm kind of mostly through productive procrastination. I end up watching a 90-minute documentary on the Manhattan Project called The Day After Trinity. It's on YouTube. It's a nice watch. It is mostly based on interviews with the scientists who were there during the project. So that was my entry point, where I think the serendipity of it all was that I happen to watch this at the same time that we are doing our kind of qual OT type readings in the first year of the PhD, where you're reading, the fundamentals of org theory and transaction cost, and why do organizations even exist? Why do people organize? And a lot of the answers to those fundamental why questions are: we organize to bring people together, work towards a common goal or objective, overcome communication costs, coordination costs, and so on. And so it was that juxtaposition of watching this documentary and learning about this bit of history while reading these fundamental texts of why do we even organize, that led to that question of, okay, but what happens when you need to keep secrets from your own people? If the whole point of organizing is to bring people together, work towards a common objective, what happens when you can't tell them what they're working on? So that was the entry point to both the topic and the method for me, where then in my second year is when I went into it. It also set my second year of my PhD is when the pandemic hit. And so then this became a perfect pandemic project in some sense because a lot of the archives are either digitally archived in terms of some of the retrospective stuff like oral histories, or they are in print books. There was some print books that were not circulated in the UK, only in the US, but I could still get it shipped from the US during the pandemic. So in that sense, it was perfect because I could bring the data to me. But it's also a rich case where well, the downside of that is I didn't get the experience of the archives in a more hands-on way. But the richness of the case is such that I hope to actually still continue and perhaps fly out to Los Alamos and other areas. The point I also want to make there is it was in some sense, and this is more luck than design, a perfect project for doing kind of historical research forum for these, let's say, American management journals, your AMJ, Org Science, ASQ types, because it was a setting where a lot of the history, like the kind of the primary research was done by people who are interested in it because clearly it's a landmark thing from the 20th century. But no one had explored it from the angle that I wanted to explore, which is this kind of OT question of how do you manage secrecy. People had explored it as a scientific achievement, as an R&D project, as from a kind of ethics perspective, from a political perspective, but not from this OT angle. The reason I think that is ideal or turned out to be ideal is because I could then focus a lot more of my time on taking the archives as they were, which again were rich because of all the work done by historians over the decades, but then really focusing on my theoretical analysis and what's the kind of angle I'm getting at, what am I trying to build? Because what I'm trying to foreshadow here is that that's the part ultimately that the journals kept pushing on as well, which is the theoretical angle.
Rohin, just
Yeah.
checking the slide is currently
Yeah,
empty.
it is. It is. Yeah, that was just kind of a preamble. So that got me into the Manhattan Project. Uh, at which point it was this the K25 gaseous uranium enrichment plant, one of the sites of the project called Rohin.
Rohin,
Uh,
you're breaking up slightly. Could you maybe repeat?
okay, yeah. Yeah, hold on. I just got a message saying internet connection unstable. Is it fine now? Do you hear me clearly
Yes, I can
currently?
hear you
Good.
fine again. I mean, it was
Okay, it
fine
was just
before, just suddenly the moment
yeah,
you
just a blip
switched.
in the connection. Yeah, yeah. Stayed in the moment they heard me say uranium enrichment. I don't know, but
I mean, it went again slightly on uranium enrichment this time. Might be worthwhile if it stays a problem, maybe switch up your video because then sometimes voice comes through a bit clearer, but let's just see.
let's see. Yeah, it should be generally it's quite stable in this particularly in this room. So let's let
It's fine. I mean, maybe try saying uranium enrichment again. That might be.
uranium enrichment.
No, we're good.
Okay, good,
Fine.
good, good. Like I said, who knows where these words take you in the online sphere. Um, okay, so on the one hand, you have the image on your left is one of the plants on one of the sites of this multi-year project. At the time, that was the largest building in the world in terms of square footage, measured in acres, really. Largest building under a single roof. So you can imagine a scale of what we're dealing with in terms of the work that needed to be done, whether it's the operations staff, the admin staff, the plant managers, and so on. By the way, all clear now, the last few sentences? Yeah, good. Okay, I see the nod.
Yeah, it's in between you go a little, we get the sort of digital crackling, but the moment I can make
Hmm.
it out. I'll give you a wave if it gets worse.
Yeah, sure, sure. Um, So on the one hand, you had this kind of massive scale of this coordination and innovation effort. Uh, on the other hand, you had intense secrecy, right? So in the bottom right of your screen, so the foreground, is Gladys Owens. She was one of the operators called the Calitron Girls, and you see it's rows of women on both ends who are operating these enrichment machines. And Gladys Owens later talks about how she well, one, of course, she didn't know what she was working on, but they found out moment the bombs were dropped because it was announced on radio by President Truman. But she didn't know what that machine does until 44 years later when she came back to Oak Ridge, Tennessee, and they had turned the site into a museum. And there was a little placard saying that, okay, this was used for electromagnetic separation and so on. And so the question I went into the archives with was one of, so how is internal secrecy managed during this innovation process? And the little acronyms you see there was the tension I cared about, which is everything we know about KC, knowledge creation, involves these flows of knowledge and kind of recombination, open communication. Everything we know about KP, knowledge protection, involves compartments, need to know, and kind of siloing people. And so, how did both get managed during the Manhattan Project? So all of this is what I went into the archives with. I quickly found myself then needing some kind of methodological apparatus to be able to do this work. And that's when I realized that there's quite a rich ongoing conversation, one that, for example, Stephanie has been part of for years now, at the intersection of um, historical research and qual. And again, I'm using qual as a shorthand for uh, kind of qualitative OT management scholarship. Of course, qualitative research is a much bigger umbrella than just what management researchers do. So I found a lot of these special issues helpful to start orienting the work. And this handbook was very helpful to me because especially the chapter by Joanne Yates, is very explicit about how we need to be doing we have like one foot in each camp in terms of qual type work and more historical data and historical sources and materials that we're dealing with. Another handbook, this one came out a bit later on, Stephanie, during my, I think, this process of doing the research, but another useful source for people doing historical research and management. So I realized that there's a bunch of stuff here which then helped scaffold some of what I went ahead and did for the project. Um, Okay, I'm pausing a little bit because I'm again seeing the unstable message. Okay, it's gone. Good. Um, so for those of you who've kind of skimmed the paper or will skim the paper, the broad outline of what I did in terms of methods, and this has stayed the same from in the publication journey, except I'll tell you. So steps one, two, and four were sorry, steps one and two were there in the first round, and steps three and four came out more during my publication journey. Step one of case reconstruction was, of course, just me making sense of what happened and to kind of dig in a little bit. At that point, I started actually with secondary sources. So I started with this massive kind of Pulitzer Prize winning book called The Making of the Atomic Bomb by Richard Rhodes. And that helped me familiarize myself with the broader context. I didn't know it at the time because I was new to the historical work in general, but the book was really helpful because it doesn't start at 1939 when fission is discovered or 1940 when the scientists are working. It starts at the turn of the 20th century with where physics was at the time and kind of the background of all of these scientists, where they did education, what who was interacting with whom, what the different milieu were at the time, which helped to give this broader context. Now, unfortunately, in the kind of management journals, that context doesn't, the reviewers and editors have no idea necessarily how much of this extra work went in to be able to better understand the actual years of analysis for me were 1939 to 45. But all the knowledge I built about what's happening from 1900 to 1939 were more implicit and come into my interpretive work, but aren't explicit in the paper at all, and almost can't be by virtue of what these journals tend to try to do. So, like I said, I started with this one book. Um, which led me to more kind of first-hand accounts. So what the book helped me do is one is identify the key protagonists because I was kind of toying between is this an analysis at the macro level of the institutions involved, the government, science, etc., or at the more micro level of the lived experience of project members and leaders and administrators. Eventually, it took me a bit more to the meso level of kind of how some people were trying to organize the practices around secrecy and sharing. So three protagonists, Leo Szilard is the book on the top. So that's a book that contains it reproduces his letter correspondence from the time, and has some oral history recollections as well. So it's a mix of both. The one in the middle is General Groves's memoir, quite famous, and the one in the bottom is a collection of Oppenheimer's letters as well. So that step one led me to kind of create this timeline, again, very familiar to people in historical work, not as much to the more contemporaneous qual type researchers. But as you can see, it starts much earlier and it involves a lot more of understanding kind of geopolitics, for example. That doesn't show up in my paper because it was not ultimately relevant to the narrow theoretical model that I'm trying to build. And in fact, one of the reviewers, who was seemed to be more of a historian, was I could see the tension there, where the historian reviewer wanted me to actually bring in a lot more of the context of the time, whereas the others were trying to hone me in on the process model and what is the process model saying. But what I'm showing you now is the backdrop that went into allowing me to even have these conversations with the reviewers and editors during the process. Uh, so another thing that ethnographers do is they write memos after, a day of field notes. I ended up writing little like kind of biographical sketches as my version of memoing, where after reading someone's letters and oral histories and correspondence, I would just write up my thoughts on this person, their background. Here I've written heady intellectual mix at Berlin. So again, none of this, I don't know at this stage what's coming into the paper or not, but I'm getting a full ground. It's unstable again. Getting a full grounding of the set. So then step two is when I brought in the qual part into the history part. If step one is a bit more of the history part, step two was a bit more of traditional qual research. I didn't do it, but more famous here is the Joya method of coding. You've got your open coding and you aggregate up from there. The only difference, what I want to point out here, one is I had to be kind of cognizant about prioritizing the more sources from first-hand accounts, and as opposed to, let's say, the Richard Rhodes book, for example. And second, and this is the thing that I only learned over time, is that uh, it really is more of detective work than data science. So true open coding is a bit more data science, where you are inducing patterns from the whole corpus of data. But here the whole corpus is huge. It's not, I've spent 5, 6 years on this project, and there's a lot of data on my laptop itself here that I haven't even looked at yet. So the corpus is too huge. So with historical work, in especially for the kind of management journal, where my purpose is not to understand everything about the project, my purpose is to dig into a specific research question, then that research question helps you be more of a detective than a data scientist. Because then I know that I'm interested in secrecy versus sharing. And so my coding is already starting with that lens in mind. So I already know kind of, at least at a high level, what I'm coding for, which is why I'm not the Excel, but look at what I've circled as first and second. I actually first put everything into big buckets of any practices, tactics, anything related to secrecy, knowledge concealment, and anything related to sharing and openness. While doing that, there was this in-between space that started opening up where it's not really secrecy, not really sharing. And so the kind of the more typical qual work where you're doing the second level coding for me happened afterwards. I started off at this aggregate level and then later started making fine-grained distinctions between things. So it was again a little more, which is why you'll see in the paper, I'm also the same thing I'm doing right now. I'm also doing in the paper where I'm not able to just name a method saying that I used the Joya coding or I did grounded theorizing. I'm having to just tell people what the steps were and why I did a given step. And that the reviewers seem to really like, where I was just giving them full transparency with justification for each step and why I did it and how it tied back to that detective-like focus on a given research question. All good? Yeah? Okay, good. Um, the things that came up later through the review process were a big push towards process model, which I didn't have. So in my early dissertation years, I was just very interested at finding that gray area in between sharing and secrecy. In fact, the first title of this paper was calling it Open Secrecy. And I was talking about kind of liminal space that happens when you as a worker are let into this area of like you kind of know that there's something going on, but you don't know what it is. So I was interested in that space.
Sorry, Rowan, you're really breaking up again.
Okay.
Do you
Let me
want
try with the
to
video
switch off
off.
the video? Yeah,
Yeah,
just
yeah,
for this
yeah,
bit, maybe when you're sharing the presentation.
yeah. Let me try the video off. Mm, There we go. Okay. Hopefully this is more stable. Can you hear me right now?
Yeah, for now,
Uh,
sounds good.
Okay, good, good. Um, So I was happy just at that in between layer, and I wanted to explore that of what is this open secrecy thing, this thing in between. Um, and then as I'll show you shortly, one big limitation of the paper was that I was kind of underplaying one of the key benefits of this historical work, which is time, right? So like things are changing over across time. So it's one thing to just uncover being like, oh, look, there's these secrecy practices, openness, and here's this in between thing. But it's another thing to then situate those at different stages along the process. How are things changing? Is it different actors involved at different stages? Yeah, is the work itself different? Is the setting different? And so that push from the reviewers led these steps 3 and 4, which were the kind of temporal bracketing. So making it up. Again, it's always in analytically important. Yes, Nick?
You're again breaking up a little.
Let me try just changing room entirely for what it's worth.
I mean, it's intermittent, so it's just sometimes it suddenly gets a sort of
Or maybe
digital.
if I just leave the door open. Okay. Um, okay. We will, okay, but okay, so Nick, you do that then. The hand raise was helpful because I caught it immediately. So whenever I see that, I'll kind of pause I'll skip a beat and then continue. Um, so then I move to this more temporal view, but even then, the point I want to emphasize is it's always analytically structured, because these journals ultimately care about the theoretical model that comes out of all of this. So in this case, it was an R&D related research question. So I structured the temporal brackets in terms of the stage of work involved. But you know, for example, if I was instead studying the kind of institutional collaboration across military and science and government and industry, I might have had very different temporal brackets based on when different actors got involved or different institutions got involved. And then finally, process theorizing, which is always a kind of a vague, there's a more craft to it than anything else. But for me, it helps to do the keyword on this slide is process matrix, where I just had kind of the stages laid out in a table by different rows in terms of, okay, so what are they working on? What are the objectives? I'm talking about secrecy, but what are the secrets? What is the secret at each stage of work? And so on. Before I jump to so I went to the reviewers with these, and then before I take you through some of their responses and what the back and forth with the reviewers, let me also spend kind of 5 minutes on some of the challenges specifically at this intersection of qual, OT, again, the kind of American type journals and doing historical work. One which is just true of any, regardless of what journal you're going through, is that every time the reviewer is sending you in a different direction, you're having to go all the way back to like almost look at new leads in the archive. So it's not like you've got a corpus of interview data, and you're just going back and reinterpreting the data. It's not a search through your kind of finite space, because ultimately when I was doing those first bits of coding, I'm excerpting things from books and letters, etc., based on what I'm interested in. But if suppose reviewers took me down the more institutional path of what's happening with the government and so on, it would have meant going all the way back and looking at things in the archive. So not even necessarily a search through fixed set of data sources. It's not as if I collected everything there is on the Manhattan Project first and then started my analysis. It is, of course, much more both iterative, but also more direct, like I said, more of a detective than a data scientist. Um, A second challenge, and this is now coming a bit closer to the management journals and the American journals, is missing counterfactuals. So if I use this one example, so on your screen is a quote from one of the physicists, Richard Feynman, uh, saying, "Okay, I went and talked to the security. I got special permission. I gave a nice lecture to the people, the engineers. It led to a complete transformation. They worked at night. They didn't need supervising. They didn't need anything." So I've got this quote. I'm using it to claim how if you share some meta information, some contextual information, people get motivated, they work hard, look at the transformation, they didn't need supervising, so on. In reality, what would happen in a more typical qual research where it's not archival is that you then look for counterfactuals. You interview someone else. You look for people who maybe weren't that motivated, or people who, after hearing Feynman's lecture, they got more curious to be like, okay, so what else are they keeping from us? Let me go dig around, find out. So you would go hunting for those kind of competing data points, which we can't, because for us the archives are what they are, and I'm having to then add my interpretive layer to it. Um, but this limitation is something that you need to just understand that there is it is what it is. But you can also point them to how it does play out in final published work as well. So if I look at an hold on, it's saying I'm getting the unstable message. Okay. So if I look at two examples from ASQ, one is contemporaneous qual. So this is Hila's paper on NASA, where she went and observed and interviewed people. She was able to build her theory based on studying counterfactuals as well. So in her case, she's looking at these, professional R&D professionals and how they are responding to open innovation. If she interviews person A who seems to be open to it and to be kind of really embracing it, she can go look for person B who seems to be hesitant or reluctant or who's pushing back. And because of that, her theoretical model also had different pathways where you've got some R&D professionals like embracing open innovation, some people not. So you're able to build a theory that incorporates different variation based on the counterfactuals. Moment you move to an archival study, also of NASA, also at ASQ, This one is Drew Carton. Uh, you see how you're having to still build a single story. So at one of the reviews at some point, that story seems too pat, like it's too. Yeah, please, Stephanie.
You were again breaking up a little.
Okay. Uh,
Maybe just go back a sentence.
yeah, sorry about that, folks. But hopefully we can still get the
You're good
thesis
again.
across.
It's very odd. It's always
Uh,
very brilliant.
yeah, and it seems very unpredictable. So I'm not like change my rhythm accordingly, but we continue to play by ear. Um, so the the point is that we've got in published. Wait, sorry, let me go up here. Yeah, you've got contemporaneous qual research where you see it in the final published output that your theorizing involves counterfactuals. So if you're looking at a particular organizational change, you're able to study people who embraced it and people who resisted it and people who changed their mind. And you can do that because you can go seek these people out. You can go interview them. Um, what happens in archival, especially when you're not on the ground collecting data, doing history, let's say in a primary way, is that you're limited by the archive. So if you don't have examples of people who were resistant to the change, then you kind of have to just build your theory based on what you've got. And we see this in the published record as well. So if I move to another ASQ, which is also based in NASA, which is Drew Carton's piece, but that's archival instead of contemporaneous. You see that his story doesn't involve examples of people resistant or people who kind of just counterfactual, where he's talking about how when JFK gave speeches, how people responded to those speeches, but it's a bit more of a singular story where you respond in a certain way in general, without having details on the counterfactuals. So other people who respond differently. Go back to the Feynman quote, people who, for example, didn't get motivated based on Feynman's quote. So the point of this slide is to tell you that it's just sometimes a hard limitation if the archives are fixed and the people involved are all mostly dead. You kind of have to build a story and focus on the interpretation working rather than being able to hunt down counterfactuals the way qual theorists might prefer. Finally, there was kind of another challenge I faced was building, it's what historians would call triangulation, but I want to distinguish between triangulating to establish a fact. So, for example, if I go back to the same quote, it's one thing to triangulate, did this speech happen? Has Feynman just like forgotten it? Is there recollection bias? Did this even happen? It's another thing to also build robustness on my interpretation of what role it played. So I'm using this to claim that, okay, people got motivated when you shared contextual information. For that, it's not again as if this was contemporary. Hold on, unstable again.
We could hear you
Okay.
fine. When you get the unstable, it's not necessarily when we can't hear
Interesting,
you. So
interesting,
just to
interesting.
make this more confusing.
Yeah. All right, cool. So the for again, if this was suppose I'm interviewing Richard Feynman, he says this to me, I would have gone and triangulated by talking to some of the engineers, getting their view on the same speech and whether they then got motivated and so on and so forth. Here, because we're limited by the archives, you're having to do a bit more of kind of bricolage where I instead have a totally different quote by a different manager, a physicist on the project, but referring to the same engineers. And this quote is about how they were kind of wondering if they're wasting their time there. The SED head was the manager was calling them all draft dodgers. Now that is helping me at least build confidence that Richard Feynman is correct about the first part of his quote that, okay, people weren't super motivated. So you see how even though I can't directly chase down and triangulate by talking to the leader and the subordinate, through different sources of data, I'm able to kind of build more robustness in my interpretation of what's going on. Similarly, elsewhere, there was a quote about the same guy now, George Kistiakowski, dismissed all the white badge people and told the rest of us what the project was about, even though he wasn't supposed to. So again, now we have a bit more evidence building up in general of this problem that the engineers weren't working the way the managers wanted them to work. So now the managers were finding ways to just tell them something about the project to try to get them to work harder. So to recap, three challenges that I was facing. One was about this interpretive bricolage that I just discussed. Before that, it was about trying to find any counterfactuals, anything about secrecy failing, for example, or secrecy succeeding but being counterproductive, and so on. And then third was the fact that I had to keep going all the way back to the archives every time the reviewers had any kind of suggestions of different directions. Good. Okay, so with all of that set in place, let me walk you through the the journey of the paper now vis-a-vis specifically reviewers and editors. So the core multiple iterations was this idea of this in between. Again, this diagram actually only came in the end, but the idea that this diagram conveys about this, you can reveal the act of concealment, you can reveal meta information, you can reveal contextual information. That idea was there from the first draft when this was just like a second year paper in my PhD. Like I said, that time I was calling it open secret, but that core has been there throughout the review process. So everything else involved building on that core. Now, the first outcome for the paper was rejection, as is common in our field. I had first sent it to ASQ when I was a PhD student, and it was I don't remember the timeline. I should have probably tried to plot that out for you all as well. But let's say roughly 2023 or 4, I submitted it. It was a year later rejected, and then a year of reworking it before sending it to org science and getting the first R&R. But it's worth dwelling on the a little bit on the rejection to start seeing some of this. What are the challenges of publishing historical research in these journals? Of course, this is sharing in confidence, and I'm not naming the editor either, but just to give you a hands-on flavor, I've copy pasted actual quotes from some of the reviewers and editors. So here, the first quote is, "My sense is you're working with interesting data, but your theorizing is underdeveloped." So as you can imagine, it's anyways like lack of theoretical contribution is a common reason for qualitative papers being rejected in these journals. On top of that, when you're doing historical work, even if they're convinced that it's rich and interesting data, that has insufficient merit on its own to get you even the R&R. Like for even the R&R, they felt they needed more of a theoretical contribution and to see more theorizing from the case. Of course, the other pitfall of doing historical research, especially if you're fortunate enough to actually find your setting fascinating and be in love with your setting, is that you are probably being a bit too descriptive and a bit too excited about the interestingness just of what happened, or of like, hey, look at what this scientist did, look at what that person did, look at here sharing little anecdotes. I had a lot more narrative history in my first. In this final draft, I managed to bring it back in, which I was pleased with. But I first draft was also more narrative as well. But it was again that pitfall of being a bit too in love with the setting, as opposed to more coldly abstracting out in an analytical way and telling people what the theory is. The second thing, which now, I mean, that was me submitting it as a PhD student, plus of course solo authored paper, so learned the lesson the hard way, but now I think of it as a rookie mistake, is that I had sent it in without any temporality. It was really just that idea of like, look, here's this gray area between sharing and secrecy. Here are these meta disclosures or these open secrecy practices. And so then this was the editor's comment, if I remember correctly, not the reviewers, which was that your data does not have much movement in it. And the reviewers noticed this as well. So that was just I think, a rookie mistake of like submitting without showing the movement in the data. And then the third one, which comes back to just issues often with historical data, is that the data seem pretty thin given the historical accounts you have. Do you see other examples of practices across time? So, what would happen in typical qual is you would have a data table, right? For each kind of thing that you're coding, you have three, four, five quotes to back it up. What happens in historical research is one is, anyways, it's not all just quote driven. You, as the scholar, are trying to get a sense of what happened. And sometimes that might be built from multiple things. It might be built from photographic evidence of the archives and not just textual quotes. And so the thickness of the data sometimes is not just quotes. But secondly, sometimes the data isn't as thick because you're limited by the archives again. So if in my case, I noticed, and later I made it a part of my theorizing, but I noticed that in fact the data gets thinner as the project goes along. It was a bit of an aha moment later when I realized, okay, that almost is further evidence for my model itself that secrecy is tightening over time. That's why the actual my data sources are, one is I have less and less kind of primary data, and second is it's getting thinner and thinner. And so my theorizing is getting a bit more and more reliant on just analytical logic rather than direct inducing from quotes. But that's so like the first and third quotes on this slide, I think the second quote is a rookie mistake that at least I would never do again. The first and third are challenges I anticipate facing going forward as well, which is interesting data, but where's the theorizing? And then the if manuscripts, the data seeming kind of thin because of the archives being what they are. This last quote is a bit more of getting us into the craft of publishing in general side of as well, regardless of historical or not, which is at some point the editor said basically you're halfway there. Now, to be honest, the once you hear that, whether it's then a major revision or a rejection is really more to do with the kind of taste function of who the editor is, or whether they know you. And I don't mean whether they know you in like a political, exchanging favors kind of way. I mean it in a genuine, like giving you the benefit of doubt because maybe they've seen you present the work somewhere in a conference. So they are like, okay, he's halfway there, but I know that Rohin can figure out the rest, take these comments on board and can get the R&R through. So all of the reason I put that in bold is because we have these substantive issues we are likely to face anyways, but you can't. One of my main learnings was also how much actually the editor matters and their taste function matters. And perhaps more so in qualitative than quantitative, and even more so in historical, where some people, if you are, for example, an ethnographer by training, by blood and DNA, you might be very skeptical about what anyone can say about anything that happened 50, 60 years ago, because an ethnographer believes in being there and viscerally breathing the air of the Manhattan Project physicists and then making claims about what happened in the Manhattan Project. And so there's something to be said about, of course, of getting lucky with the right taste function of the set of reviewers and editors that you get as well. Now, in the first year after the rejection, I took on board the comments, which were very helpful. Um, I did some of the typical kind of balancing act we have to do, where one of my ASQ reviewers was definitely a historian, because their comments were much more towards definitely a business historian, let's say. I don't think it's necessarily a full-on kind of a historian from a history department, but their comments were very much around the context and the historical kind of the a almost a historical way of looking at the Manhattan Project, where I'm really just treating it as a box, without bringing in the broader World War II and the geopolitics and the cultural and what was society like at the time, how that would influence how workers' acceptance of secrecy, all of which is very valid and actually true. If I was writing a monograph, I would have to bring all of that into account. But I knew that since I was targeting org science next, there's no point going more broad and historic, kind of bringing in all of that context. It's really much more on the points, the point about how I needed movement in my data, and how I needed to kind of build my analytical categories better. So in that 1 year, I did mostly work on bringing that movement in. So that's when, if you remember steps 3 and 4 of my method, the bracketing and the process matrix, that's when that came in. So after the ASQ rejection and before the first org science submission. Oh wow, okay, the time is really flowing by. Let me quickly wrap up here. So the org sci R&R then led to kind of an issue that I think is a good issue to have, which is often you submit a first round, and people find it not focused enough, not a clear theoretical contribution. In my case, this org science first round, they found it too focused, like too narrow. Like people say that, oh, your paper should have one idea. What is the one takeaway? So I really submitted it with that concept of, okay, here's the one takeaway. It's these meta disclosures. That's it. But because I gave them all of the other things, because I had brought in the process matrix, I gave them multiple moving pieces kind of by the side of this core idea. The reviewers could just tell me to bring it all back in and build a rich history. And so that led to, oh, the animation is that led to me then building a process model. The key thing, that first bullet point, is the editor's comments. So I think I also had to rely on the editor valuing the question in itself and the phenomenon in itself, because then your mindset moves from, is this data thick enough? Is the theoretical contribution clear enough? Towards a mindset of, look, it's a great question and a great setting. Let's see what we can reliably say from given the data, given the setting, because anything we can say on this question, we should try to shed light on. And so that helped as well. And then there were still things that I couldn't, that reviewers wanted I couldn't show, like aggregation mechanisms. How did it, because again, the data is very fixed on specific actors whose accounts I have versus don't have. So there were always limitations. So in the end, this is not for eventually did a more typical, uh, even though I didn't actually want to, or and I still don't see it as particularly relevant, but to please the reviewers, it was there. Okay, that is the end. Let me switch on the video and move to a different room for what it's worth. Okay,
Maybe stop sharing. Sometimes the sharing also is
yeah.
that overloads. Great. Thank you very much. That was super interesting. Sorry that we had a bit of a technical issues. Hopefully in another room that's a bit easier.
Yeah, yeah. And sorry, Shannon, I ran way over time. I know you had a lot of questions.
No, you're good. Don't worry at all. Perfect. Steph, are you happy for me to just take the floor then? Great. Well, thanks so much for that really interesting presentation. And also the paper is great. I had a really good time reading it. I actually am one of the readers in our department teaches a course